Kinloch against Her Majesty's Advocate.
Lord Reed will give the judgment of the court.
James Kinloch was convicted in 2010 of money laundering offences. He was granted leave to appeal to this court by the High Court of Justiciary in Scotland. The court did not give its reasons for granting leave, but it granted leave in circumstances where those acting for Mr. Kinloch were maintaining that police officers had violated his right to respect for his private life, as guaranteed by the European Convention on Human Rights, by keeping him under surveillance in the public street while he was in the course of committing the offences. The first question which this court has had to consider is whether it has jurisdiction to deal with this appeal. The final court in relation to criminal matters in Scotland is the High Court of Justiciary. The finality of its jurisdiction is qualified only by this court's jurisdiction under the devolution statutes in respect of Scotland, as also Northern Ireland and Wales, to hear appeals against decisions concerning devolution issues. In particular, questions as to whether the devolved administrations have acted beyond the powers conferred upon them. One of the limits of their powers is that they cannot act in violation of a person's rights under the European Convention on Human Rights as given effect by the Human Rights Act. The police, however, are not part of the devolved administration, and this court, therefore, ordinarily has no jurisdiction to decide on an appeal from the High Court of Justiciary whether or not police officers have violated a person's convention rights. Those representing Mr. Kinloch sought to get around that problem by arguing that if the police had violated his rights by keeping him under observation, it followed that the evidence of what they saw should not have been admitted at his trial, as its admission would breach his convention right to a fair trial. That question, however, is again one which this court has no jurisdiction to decide, since the admissibility of evidence is a matter for the trial court, and the court is not part of the devolved administration. When the High Court granted leave to appeal to this court, however, it must have considered that there was a devolution issue which it had decided. The only devolution issue which might have been raised was whether the prosecution, which is part of the devolved administration, had violated Mr. Kinloch's convention rights when, at the trial, it led the evidence of the police officers concerning the results of their observations. It is not, however, apparent that that question concerning the conduct of the prosecution was focused before the Scottish courts or decided by them. With considerable hesitation, this court has decided that it should nevertheless deal with the appeal, partly because there was, in reality, a devolution issue in this case, albeit one which was not focused by Mr. Kinloch's representatives as clearly as it ought to have been, and partly because the High Court of Justiciary, which was in the best position to know what it had decided, took the view that leave to appeal could properly be granted, and the Crown did not oppose the granting of leave. Turning then to the merits of the appeal, leading the officer's evidence could only be a breach of Mr. Kinloch's convention rights if, in the first place, the evidence had been obtained in violation of his right to respect for his private life. It is therefore necessary for this court to consider whether that right was violated when he was kept under surveillance. The surveillance lasted for about 3.5 hours one morning. Mr. Kinloch was seen leaving his car and entering the block of flats where he lived, then leaving the flats carrying a bag and entering a car which drove off. He was later observed leaving other locations and cars in Glasgow, and then entering a taxi carrying a bag. The taxi was later seen parked outside his brother's home. That was the extent of the observation. Police officers then approached the taxi, Mr. Kinloch and his brother were detained, and large sums of money were recovered. The trial proceeded on the basis that the surveillance had not been authorised under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers, Scotland Act of 2000. Decisions of the European Court of Human Rights show that measures effected in a public place outside a person's home will not without more be regarded as interfering with his right to respect for his private life. A person who walks down the street has to expect that he will be visible to any member of the public who happens also to be present. So too if he leaves his house and gets into a car. The Strasbourg court has not had to consider situations where a person's movements in a public place are watched and noted down by the police when they suspect the person of criminal activity. But it couldn't reasonably be suggested that a police officer who came upon a person who had committed a crime in a public place and simply noted down his observations in his notebook was interfering with a person's right to respect for his private life. The question is whether it makes a difference that notes of his movements in public are kept by the police over a period of time as part of a planned operation, as happened in this case. This court considers that the answer to that question is to be found by considering whether Mr. Kinloch had a reasonable expectation of privacy while he was in public view as he moved between his car and the block of flats where he lived, and engaged in his other activities that day in places that were open to the public. There is nothing to suggest that he could reasonably have had any such expectation of privacy. He engaged in these activities in places where he was open to public view by neighbours, by persons in the street, or by anyone else who happened to be watching what was going on. He took the risk of being seen and of his movements being noted down. The criminal nature of what he was doing, if that was what it was found to be, was not an aspect of his private life that he was entitled to keep private. Since there was no breach of Mr. Kinloch's rights by the police when they carried out their observations, it follows that there cannot have been any breach of his right to a fair trial when the prosecution led evidence of the results of those observations. For these reasons, the court unanimously dismisses the appeal.